Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger with the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. At the end of last year, the end of 2017, Helga forecast that 2018 will be the year in which the era of geopolitics is ended. I think the developments of the last week have been a major step toward that actually coming into fruition, with the extraordinary summit which took place in Singapore between President Trump and President Kim Jong-un of North Korea, as well as with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference in China, and then with the collapse of the old order with the G7 or G6 or G whatever in Canada. So Helga, why don't we start with the developments that took place in Singapore, because these were earth-shaking and I think worthy of being the first topic of our discussion today.
Well, I'm actually quite pleased to tell you, you may know it already or not, that two Norwegian parliamentarians have proposed the Peace Nobel Prize for President Trump. Now, I find this very appropriate in contrast to the Peace Nobel Prize given to Obama for absolutely nothing, just the contrary. But I think this development of North Korea and the United States finding a way to completely transform an old adversary relationship into one of cooperation and a bright future. I think this is really a fantastic development, and I know that all the mainstream media of the West are having apoplectic attacks over this. But if you look at it, I think it is absolutely promising. First of all, the facts you all know. They agreed on the complete denuclearization of North Korea in return for the prospect of making North Korea a prosperous and wealthy country. Now, I find it very interesting that the White House, actually between Trump and the National Security Council, they produced a 4-minute video where the two options for North Korea were portrayed. One is the old status and war, or to have a complete modernization of the country with modern railway. They even showed the Chinese maglev running, and people prosperous, productive. And I think this was very good, because this video is exactly what will happen, and it goes very far beyond a similar video which was produced by South Korea in the past. And Trump showed it to Kim Jong-un in the meetings, and then he also showed it before giving a press conference. And I watched this entire press conference, and I must say, I would advise all of you, our viewers, to do likewise, because you hear so much about Trump being this and that. And I think the way he conducted himself in this lengthy press conference, fencing off the most typical old-fashioned thinking questions from mainly American journalists, he did not let himself be provoked. The journalists tried to ask him, but what will you do? What is your punishment if North Korea does not comply? And he wouldn't go into this trap, but he just said that he was very confident that this process was on a good way. And, obviously very important was that he also announced that the United States would stop what he called the war games, the US-South Korean military maneuvers. And obviously this is psychologically very important for the North Koreans, because if you have these war games on your doormat all the time, this creates a permanent psychological terror. And I think, people who have to still form that judgment about how to look at this, they should just consider that the South Korean people were absolutely enthusiastic. They were happy in the streets. President Moon, who watched the live stream coming from the conference from Singapore, applauded several times. And, given the fact that the German unification which took place now, almost 28 years ago. Wait a second. 29 years ago. People in Germany may remember the absolute jubilance and happiness of families hugging each other who haven't been together for very many years. Friends just, falling into each other's arms, kissing each other. And it was a joy that the German unification did not produce only happiness afterwards, had to do with the larger geostrategic environment, like Bush and Thatcher, Mitterrand. They all were extremely hostile to the process of German unification. And therefore, the East German states were practically economically dismantled pretty much. And the environment in North Korea is obviously completely different. So I would like to just say that I'm very optimistic that this process will succeed for the very simple reason that this is taking place in a completely different strategic context, namely of the Belt and Road Initiative, the integration of the Belt and Road Initiative with the Eurasian Economic Union. And, these kinds of economic development plans, which also Russia spoke about and China said they would contribute, and also together with the United States take over security guarantees for North Korea. These economic plans take place in the context of the intention to develop the Far East of Russia, to integrate it with all of Asia, which was discussed at the East Economic Forum in Vladivostok last September, and it was also discussed in the inter-Korean dialogue in April between the two presidents of the two Koreas. So I think the perspective that North Korea soon will be integrated in the Eurasian transport system, the railways, two railways connecting to the Trans-Siberian Railway, to the Chinese railway system, and that you will have a complete transformation of this part of the world. And I think Trump is absolutely right. He said the past does not determine the future. Real change is possible. And I think this is a very good development. And all the naysayers, they should just, go home and think.
Well, the point you just made, I think, was one of the most important, that both presidents talked about overcoming the past. And Kim Jong-un said that we need to develop a new friendly attitude between our peoples as opposed to the animus. And of course, that's what Trump has displayed in both the lead up to the summit and the aftermath of the summit. And this is one of the things that's angering the people you mentioned who aren't happy about this, the fact that he's saying, look, this is a new period, it's a new time. And I think, Helga, this is probably the most important thing, this idea of entering into a new era. And this, of course, is what you've been talking about for the last years, that we now are on the verge of this new emergence of a Eurasian century.
Yes, I think that that spirit, is clearly prevalent in Asia. It was also the expressed view of, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi after the SCO summit in Qingdao in China. This summit, was an extraordinary milestone, where Wang Yi afterwards said, the SCO represents 3.1 billion people, and it is already now a completely new system of international relations built on mutual trust, on cooperation, on friendship, on common aims. And it is a new model and leaves behind and transcends the old geopolitical order, Cold War, exclusive clubs, clash of civilization. All of these are left behind, and a new era of cooperation has been established. So I think this was very beautiful because the summit, the initial banquet, was opened by President Xi Jinping with a reference to Confucius, He said Qingdao is in Shandong province, which is the home of Confucius and Confucianism, and he should guide the future of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, I think Xi Jinping is a philosopher, and just contrast that, can you imagine that any European leader would open an EU summit with the words, we should have the Plato's spirit or Shakespeare's spirit or Schiller's spirit, guide the future of the European Union. I mean, nothing is more impossible to think than that at this moment. So I think, the future lies in Asia, and, the kind of cooperation and determination to create a better world for all people living on this planet is being realized in Asia right now. And I think it is a very good thing that President Trump, is definitely, helping the best he can to make this order succeed, despite the trade tensions and despite the remaining problems which are still there. I'm absolutely confident that the spirit and the dynamic of this new phenomena, these new forces which Wang Yi spoke. He said there are new forces at work which make this all possible. And I think that is the dynamic of our time, the trend of our time. And it's a good thing. It's wonderful. And everybody who loves humanity and who loves peace should be absolutely happy.
Well, I knew what would make you happy in particular is that it wasn't just a discussion of trade deals or security concerns, but it did take place, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, on a philosophical level. And this is spilling over into the talks between President Trump and the North Korean president for precisely the reason that the other countries are involved in the Korean summit. And President Trump made a point to thank China, Japan, South Korea, and Russia. And Helge, I think there may be a couple more things you want to bring up on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. India and Pakistan participated. This really has become something in big contrast to the morose gathering that took place in Canada, the declining G7. Why don't you give us your thoughts on that the difference between these two summits?
Well, I think that the SCO summit is the result of a conscious effort to create a more human world. And I really think that the fact that, as we discussed it already on this show, Modi and Xi Jinping have, reset the policy between India and China, that Pakistan and India, under the umbrella of the SCO, can now talk about issues, I think is a wonderful development as well. And, I think that the whole dynamic is one of cooperation, mutual trust, and, how countries should relate to each other. I mean, that is a normal thing. As a matter of fact, many years ago, 35 years ago, I created the Schiller Institute, or 34 years ago, with the idea that you need a new foreign policy, that nations should relate to the best tradition of each other and not the worst. And, that is what I see now. So you have a deep discussion about, the fundamental principles of each culture. In China, you have Confucius and Mencius, which were both mentioned by Xi Jinping. In India, you have the Vedic tradition, the Gupta period. You have the Indian Renaissance. Much of this was referred to by Modi in his previous speech at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, which took place just a little bit before. So you have, on the side of these leaders, an understanding that you have to look for the most profound image of man in the respective culture and what follows for politics out of that. Out of Confucius' ideal of eternal learning, of lifelong learning and character improvement, comes the harmony in the family. And out of harmonious families comes harmony in the nation and among nations as well. And you have similar ideas in the idea of a cosmic order in the Indian philosophy, which should guide our behavior on the planet. And you have the idea of ahimsa, that, basically man has to educate himself up to the point where he is incapable of having any harmful thought. Now, this happens to be the same idea like you find in Nikolaus of Kues or Leibniz or Schiller's conception of the beautiful soul. But naturally, that kind of thinking is completely absent in the Western world right now, in the G7 or G6 against one or G4, because actually the G4, there are only 4 countries left which are absolutely determined to keep the sanctions against Russia and similar things. Germany, France, Great Britain, and Canada. So it's not exactly a strong alliance. So, I think the contrast between the SCO meeting and the really catastrophic failure of the G7 meeting in Canada could not be more obvious. And I think, the fact that they can only be negative and, are also having huge fights among themselves is a reflection that this old order is collapsing, and it's collapsing very fast. And, one big area where you can see that is the refugee crisis in Europe, which has come back in full force.
How significant is it, do you think, that President Trump brought up bringing Russia back into the G7 to make it the G8 again?
Well, I'm not, Putin was very funny. He said that he would invite the next G7 meeting to Moscow. But, I don't think that they are naturally putting a huge priority of being part of something which is clearly, not the most dynamic model in the world. And I think much more important is, the orientation towards Asia for Russia at this point. Now, Foreign Minister Lavrov made an important point after the Singapore meeting. He said, in order to really guarantee that this process succeeds, one has to bring back the 6-power talks, which involves naturally two Koreas, Japan, China, the United States, and Russia. And I think that is absolutely to the point. Now, I think that the whole situation will change because you have now complete disunity in Europe. You have 2 new governments who are absolutely in favor of restoring the relations with Russia. One is Austria, which just hosted a very important summit for President Putin. And the other one is the new Italian government, where basically the Deputy Prime Minister Salvini just came out and called for an alliance with Russia to fight terrorism, and saying basically that that you cannot deal with extremism of all forms unless you cooperate with Russia. So I think this is all changing very rapidly, and I wouldn't be surprised if things get really turbulent in Europe much more, and changes will occur. And one can only hope that they go in the direction of cooperating with the new Silk Road and not just in the direction of chaos, which is also an imminent possibility.
Well, you mentioned the crisis, the refugee crisis, which is once again back on the front burner, even though it's not the same numbers as a couple of years ago. But what's happening with this? How has this become an issue once again?
Well, first of all, there are many refugees, because the weather was bad for some time. Now it's better. So a lot of refugees are just lined up and waiting to be, put in by human traffickers in these boats. One ship, the Aquarius, just was refused to enter a port in Italy. Then, there was a huge brawl because, the Macron attacked the Italian government because of it. And then the Italians answered what a high horse Macron was sitting on, given the fact that they had a terrible treatment of tens of thousands of refugees over the years. Now, finally, Macron and Conte talked on the telephone, and a state visit will occur on Friday. So we have to see how that goes. But naturally, and the refugees were finally accepted by the new Spanish government, the Sanchez government. But what happens when the next ship comes? This crisis, so this has now led to a huge coalition crisis in Germany, where Seehofer, the interior minister and former Bavarian minister president, wanted to present his master plan. Merkel basically forbid it, whereupon Seehofer and Chancellor Kurz from Austria and Salvini from Italy got all on the telephone, and Kurz was talking about a coalition of the willing to agree to basically send refugees back at the border if they are already registered in any one European country. Now that is a completely, I cannot, and Merkel on the other side, together with the SPD, wants to find a European solution, and this has created a complete turmoil because, only 3 parliamentarians are backing Merkel of her own party. The SPD on the other side says if Merkel capitulates to Seehofer, they may even go for a confidence question and new elections. So this is highly unstable. And I cannot see how either of these solutions should function because, if you close the borders, that's what they want, to make a fortress America, fortress Europe, to increase the Coast Guard, to, basically make sure that no refugees can come in. If you close the internal borders, here goes the Schengen Agreement, and that was the basis on which the euro actually was possible, because if you don't have open borders within Europe, a common currency doesn't make sense. So I think this thing could explode at any moment. And, all of these ideas are non-workable and are a reflection of the fact that these establishments just don't understand that the only way how you can solve the refugee crisis in a human way would be a large-scale development of Africa. And China is doing that already. So if the Europeans would be, intelligent, or these governments rather, they would just say, we take the offer of China to cooperate in large-scale infrastructure and other development plans for Africa, so that we create an incentive that all the young people from Africa want to stay home and build their country rather than risking their life by crossing the Sahara and dying of thirst, or crossing the Mediterranean and drowning. So, you have to change the policy towards Africa if you want to solve this problem.
And Helga, on that note, it does appear that there are people in the Italian government who are making that point. One of the new ministers, Professor Gerasi, has a document out where he talks about this idea of Italy and other European countries working with China to provide the infrastructure and create the means by which people can stay in their homes and actually have a future. What else do you see in the emergence of this new Italian government as a positive part of the transformation of Europe?
Well, there was first the appointment of ministers, of which several have very decent positions, on Glass-Steagall, on the creation of a national bank, on renegotiating the Maastricht Treaty conditions, by not accepting the austerity, by going for an investment program. So there are many interesting points. They are not completely unproblematic because there are also many greeny ideas in it. But now the second round of people have been appointed in the positions of Undersecretary of Ministries. And there you have actually, I don't know the total number, but something like between 6, 8, or 10 of them who have signed an appeal by our sister organization in Italy, the Movisol, for Glass-Steagall, a letter to President Trump to implement Glass-Steagall. So I expect that, given the fact that the financial system is, in a very precarious condition, that once this government consolidates, which it is in the process of doing right now, that you will see a lot more motion towards Glass-Steagall. Now, Glass-Steagall and the laws of the European Union are incompatible. So, but it's a very promising development, and one reflection that good things are going on is the fact that the EU representative for the negotiation of the Brexit, former Belgian Prime Minister Verhofstadt, just came out with a huge attack saying that the following people are stooges of Putin, Farage, Le Pen, Salvini, and Orban. Now, there are already some people now suing him, and you cannot just claim that somebody is a stooge and paid agent when they are not. So, you can see the freak out level is really quite big. But I think the potential is also there, given the fact that there is a motion towards cooperation with Russia coming from several places in Europe now. And there is also a softening, and some people are reviewing and say, look, there is the biggest infrastructure development in history, which is already writing the rules. The new WTO will be written by the new Silk Road. Why not join it and profit from all of these developments? And the hidden champions, in European Mittelstand and so forth, they have so much to contribute to, solve the problems of this world, that rather than making a fortress Europe and trying to, keep every foreigner out, they should just really change the policy. And I think the time has come where all these arrogant people who think that they are the best and the brightest, when in reality they are not so smart at all, and they don't want to acknowledge that the neoliberal neocon geopolitical system is just going under. It's going under because it favors only an elite, a financial elite, an establishment, and it is harmful to the majority of the people. And therefore, the model of the new Silk Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization model, the BRICS model, all of these are more attractive, especially to the developing countries. And the West would just do so much better if they would say, okay, we have to rethink, and maybe we can reinvent ourselves if we cooperate with this new dynamic. And I think the breakthrough of Singapore has created the example that you can do it. You can change history if you want, and if you have the will, and if you have the good intention. And I think people should follow this example.
Well, there's one other place where change is needed, and that is the continuing war on the people of Yemen, coming from the Saudi Arabian government, the United Arab Emirates, with some support from the United States and the United Kingdom. There's a battle that's underway right now for the city of Hodada, I guess it is, where there was a bombing of a Doctors Without Borders hospital. This is the port where most of the food comes into the country, and it's already a country which is 60% of the people face food insecure. Helga, what can be done? There are some congressmen who signed a letter calling for an immediate move for an authorization to use military force, with the idea being that the United States would not participate in this, would move to stop it. This is something that needs to be brought also before the population of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, already before this storm on Hodeidah started, Yemen was characterized by the United Nations as the worst humanitarian catastrophe on the planet. And the Russian Foreign Ministry just commented on the fact that this storm against this port has started, saying that this will make a political solution so much harder. But I think there is one country right now which really could stop it, and that is the United States. If the United States would just make sure Saudi Arabia does not have the means to continue this, it would. And I find it promising that even two members of the Knesset, of the Israeli parliament, basically commented on the Singapore summit by saying that this could be a model to solve the Middle East crisis, including the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, I think that is the way to go. I think military solutions just don't function, and we have to, when I said at the beginning of the year that geopolitics must be overcome, because geopolitics is the basis of war. In the last century, it was the basis of two world wars. And I think we have to come to a situation where in the presence or given the fact that nuclear weapons exist, which could lead to the annihilation of civilization, I think we have to move to a world where war is absolutely outlawed as a means of conflict resolution. And this is why I think now, with this change dynamic, a summit between President Trump and President Putin is of the absolute urgency and should follow. I know that the spokesman of the State Department basically said that both sides are looking at it and looking at preparations, but I think it's very urgent. And I think this idea that the Middle East must find a similar approach like the Korea situation is absolutely to the point.
Well, and on that point, I'd like to finish by asking you to say something about this wonderful conference that the Schiller Institute sponsored this last weekend in New York City under the theme Dona Nobis Pacem. You participated in it. What are your thoughts about how this kind of event points the way for this change as well, the new Silk Road spirit taking over?
Well, I think it was a quite successful conference. We had with a student meeting on Friday, US students for the new Silk Road. And then we had on Saturday a very important conference where we had the deputy consul or ambassador from the United Nations of the Russian mission, who I think was very important for people to see, that these Russians are not the way the New York Times describes them, but they're human beings who are funny and have a lot to give. And then we had a lot of strategic discussion over the day. And then the next day we had a beautiful concert with American spirituals, and then the Beethoven C minor Mass, which was performed by the chorus of the Schiller Institute. And the church where the concert took place was completely full, and people were really inspired and understand that you need classical culture to elevate people, to bring out the most noble aspect of humanity. And in that spirit, you can solve any problem. So I would like to ask you again, join the Schiller Institute, become part of a Renaissance movement, and help us to bring the Silk Road spirit, or as they were saying in the Shanghai Cooperation meeting, the Shanghai spirit, which is really the spirit of Confucius and Mencius and Schiller and Leibniz. Bring the spirit to the Western world, because we can only all profit of it.
Well, with that, I think we'll conclude. Helge, thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.